Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Bicep community call for April. Here's our team. As you can see, we have two newcomers. We have Johnny and Dante. Dante can't make this call this month, but he will make next call. Johnny, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself really quickly.
Hi, I am not new to Microsoft, but new to this team and really excited to be here.
Thanks, Johnny. Again, here are our core maintainers. They've been doing an amazing job. We love them, as always. And what is our community call for? It's for you guys, not for us. We are giving updates every month. So definitely please be active in the Q&A because we will answer all your questions in chat. But at the end, you could also come off mute and ask it to us directly. Yeah, like I said, use the chat. If you have questions, raise your hand. There, you can unmute yourself as well. All right, on to you, Alex.
Okay, I think, can you click one more time? I didn't mean to animate this slide.
I don't know if you want to take
Sure.
over. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's use the magic of Teams. And I think I have taken over. Cool. So we talked about our monthly release cadence in the last call. So this is the first evidence that we're actually doing it successfully. So I see no reason why we won't have 0.6 out by May 2nd at the latest. Maybe we'll get it out tomorrow and make April, but it'll be right around that. Obviously, this is just a month's worth of work, so these releases are going to be much smaller, but one nice thing is we get to call more visibility to things that maybe we otherwise would have had to skip over, so this is nice. We'll go back. We have a new management group resource ID function. So this is to help fix a bug with the resource ID function that didn't work at all scope. So if you tried to use the regular resource ID function, not the subscription resource ID function or tenant resource ID function, if you try to use the regular resource ID function at non-resource group scopes, it basically just didn't work. Most of our deployments are happening at resource group scopes, so we didn't get a ton of feedback on this problem, but it did come up, especially with Azure landing zones and some of these more complex deployments. So this should now be working everywhere you expect, the way that you expect. If you don't see that happening for whatever reason, please do let us know. We added a force download option to Bicep Restore. So when you're restoring modules, whether you're doing it automatically or you're doing the restore yourself, you can now force the cache to be deleted and recreated. So if you're pushing to the same version multiple times, which generally we don't encourage, but we get that people do it for testing or other reasons, you can now force the restore. This works both in CLI and VS Code in the Bicep CLI. And then we do need to add it to the AZ CLI as well. We have to do this kind of in stages generally. So in the next month or so, we should have AZ Bicep Restore supporting force as well. We're now this is a subtle one. We're now more efficiently using JSON and load text content together. So this has become a pretty common pattern for loading an arbitrary set of data. It's very convenient. We basically, depending on how you access the data in this file, we would kind of replicate the data many times throughout the generated ARM template. It doesn't mean anything for the Bicep code that you write, but this will help keep your ARM template smaller. This is another one. We discovered this through the Azure landing zone effort. They're trying to orchestrate this pretty massive deployment with lots and lots of modules. So they were hitting the limit in some cases. So this is going to allow them to get the size of the template down well below 4 megabytes, so they shouldn't run into this anymore. And if you were running into this, obviously, this is more efficient for you as well. And then we fixed a bug for deploying management groups from tenant scope, another ALZ discovered issue, but we expect other people to run into this. So if you're setting up a management group hierarchy in a new tenant, there was an issue. We were basically we had a false positive on our validation. So now we're handling that correctly. And I think, oh yes, and then we're now handling ambiguous function signatures better. So if you are typing out a function and it has several different signatures with different argument pairings, we wouldn't give you a very helpful error. Now we will show you all the different signatures that are possible, so that you just have a better kind of discovery experience for these sorts of things. And those are some of the big things. I'm sure I missed some. We'll publish them in the release notes of 0.6. Any major questions from the chat or otherwise?
Yeah, looks like there's 2 questions in chat.
Cool. Is it the whole cache for the registry or just the specific modules? That is a good question. I don't know if Stefan Lapointe is here and can answer that.
Yes, I'm here.
Hello.
Okay, so what was the question again? If it was the whole cache or just for the module?
Yep.
That when we force the cache restore, it's only for the modules used in the current file. So it's not the whole cache; it's just the modules used for the current file you're editing or you're targeting with the CLI.
And that was a contribution from Stefan. That's why I went to him with the question. So awesome that came from, yes, you are a maintainer, so you are in more meetings with us, but fantastic that sort of thing is coming from the community. So thank you. Will there be a way to pass a symbolic resource as a parameter to a module? There will be eventually. This is one that we, there's a couple outstanding big things that we want to fix with our implementation of that feature before we release it more broadly. If you want more details or you want to test out basically an experimental build of it, we can help you with that. But we need some more time to build that out properly. Any other questions before moving on? Cool. Okay, I did not get a chance to edit this slide. So this is the same as last month. 0.7, I'll put a link to our projects board, which everyone should be able to read. That is breaking things down very neatly by milestone. So we have 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, and 1.0 represented right there right now, and that will continue to expand. So that'll give you a better sense and a more accurate sense of what literally work is going to get done in a particular milestone. So here's our 0.7 board. Let me know if folks have issues opening that. So the big stuff has not changed. Extensibility is something that we continue to work on, passing resources, this build decompile API to power portal export type scenarios and deploying Bicep from the portal as well. And then 1.0, stricter breaking changes and type updates separate from core updates. So you can get all the latest and greatest Azure types without having to actually update Bicep. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. So we're gonna pass. Oh, go ahead, Stephanie.
There looks like there was one in chat.
Is there any priority on getting IntelliSense support for container registry modules versions? It is something that we are talking about and agree is very important to be done. I hope that we'll have something in the next 2 to 3 months. Fingers crossed, but not totally confident in that ETA right now, but it will get done. It'll definitely get done before 1.0.
There's also one on, is there any command to get module restored downloaded as a Bicep file in the current directory?
Module restored downloaded as a Bicep file in, no, there is not. And I think Ryan Nowak, did you create an issue about this? I remember we had a conversation about it.
I'm pretty sure I did create an issue for it. I can try and dig it up.
Cool. They are in your cache directory. You can always find them. Oh, no, they're not because it's the compiled.
Bicep files in registry, when you do Bicep publish, it's compiling to ARM.
Right.
So
Okay, thank you for looking up that issue, Ryan. What is the plan for sorting documentation README links to the different module versions? I see what you're saying. So the README is changing as new versions are coming out. Marius, is that what you're describing?
Yeah, so I'm from the Carmel team, so it might be a Carmel specific issue, but also for the public Bicep registry, when you then publish different versions of a module, how are we going to, as a consumer or as consumers of those modules, how are we going to get to the different documentations for the different modules? And is there any plans on your end to aid in that matter?
Yeah, I think that one is worth opening an issue for in the Bicep public registry repo, so we can talk through it. I think you're bringing up a good pain point. The Bicep tooling is self-documenting in some sense, but if you have object or array of object parameters, you really need the documentation. So we should think through that more. Cool. The main topics we have for today are a couple of proposals. So Ryan and Justin, our colleagues, are here to walk through those proposals and get your feedback on them. So I will turn it over, I think, to Justin first.
Yeah, I believe. Can everybody hear me? I assume so.
Yep.
All right. So hey, my name is Justin. I work at Microsoft. I am a software engineer and working in the Azure organization. I used to work on .NET, so I used to work on ASP.NET Core. So if you potentially recognize me there, like that's where I'm from. This is my first community call, so I'm not like 100% certain about the entire structure here, but effectively, me and my team have been working with Bicep Extensibility, which is a feature that is starting to be worked on or is being worked on in Bicep to be able to import things that are not necessarily like ARM resources. So for example, being able to import a Kubernetes resource as an example. Excuse me. With that, we've started to actually try to implement our own version of one of these extensibility providers, and we hit some snags around how configuration is passed through and the capabilities that we wanted in extensibility didn't quite align with what was possible today. And so we've been chatting with the ARM team internally a little bit to figure out like what exactly the, thank you Emily for sharing, what exactly we would like to do here for being able to pass configuration kind of at like deployment time for a provider. So for example, like I think if you scroll down just a little bit, the like kube config is this is good right here. The kube config, for example, is something you can actually call or add to your Kubernetes import. And so I don't know how familiar people are with the syntax for extensibility, but effectively, like you can import Kubernetes into your Bicep file via this mechanism right here. And so you can pass in the Kubernetes config and pass that parameter in, and then you can propagate that through. This pattern works, but it gets a little bit tricky when you actually need to, pass a good amount of things to one of these like import statements. And also, if we ever consider about like allowing options to be on the import for the AZ aspect, like I think Ryan's proposal will go a little bit more of the import AZ stuff. It gets really tricky to pass all these parameters around back and forth. And I think like the thing to think about here is like on the, like when you're like in a Bicep file and you're just like trying to look at, for example, like you just want to get the resource group, like you can just call the resource group function. Like why is the Azure provider have this capability, but it's not really possible for anything else to really have this kind of capability as well? Because like the resource group, when you do a deployment, is kind of like ambient information. Like when you do a deployment, this resource group's like part of your deployment. It's available there as well. So with that, we chatted with the ARM team. We're like, hey, like it'd be really nice to like specify some configuration that is like part of a kind of at deployment time information that is like pervasive across the entire context of a deployment. And what I mean by that is like when you have like modules and submodules in something, like you can have information that is specific to one of these imports that can be used across any module and anything like that. So for example, like you can specify like the kube config as something on command line, and or like as a provider or as something that's external to the actual template, and pass that through across multiple modules and use it that way. So I believe the main part of the proposal is to add a section to the Microsoft.Resource deployments, Microsoft Resource deployments template, to add a section called providers. And this would effectively allow you to specify configuration that is specific to an import. So I can specify on command line or external to the actual template what the kube config would look like for the Kubernetes import. And from there, it would actually be available to that import statement as well. Through that, there's a bunch of like nuanced things that are, through the rest of the proposal around like a lot of these specific things, specifically around like how this would look in files for Bicep versus Azure and all this stuff. What this could potentially look like if we ever want to deal with AZ. The scope stuff is something I started with. I'm not 100% sold about the right direction here. I think that we'll need to think about this separately as a separate proposal, because I think there's a lot of things that can be on this AZ import. And then just specific things about like configuration between how things flow between modules. The idea is that like things would flow ambiently. So like this information that you set, like for the symbolic name for whatever import you have, if you were to call a module, or if you would have a module inside your Bicep file, that information would flow ambiently into the next module. And then also talking about some just specific things around parameters collision, specifying CLI, configuration files, all these things. Pretty much I'm just trying to be as descriptive in this proposal as possible. I came from the .NET team, so the .NET team is very much like, yeah, write everything down in a proposal because it'll come back to bite you. So I think that's the primary motivation here, and I think there's a lot of exciting things that can happen, especially if we're moving to allowing things to be specified for the AZ import in the future. I think there's a lot of potential there to do some really awesome things. And I think that this is going to be some really critical functionality that's required to use extensibility in the future, especially as extensibility becomes more and more used. So, yeah.
And for whatever it's worth for folks on the call, I kind of think about this as global config for providers. So right now we have the AZ provider that's imported by default, and we're going to have a conversation about that with Ryan's proposal in a second. Maybe we should have flipped the order, but that's fine. And with Kubernetes, that's also going to have config associated with it. And as you're traversing between modules and things like that, this is to remove the paper cut of basically having to shepherd that provider config all around your project, and you can just do it once at the quote unquote project level and then not have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah. So if you scroll down, Emily, actually to the bottom of this proposal, or like someone here, I think I mentioned something about, is this globals? Pretty much. I just asked like, hey, is what I'm specifying here actually just globals? Yeah. The answer is maybe. The concept of provider is, this is configuration that is readily accessible to all modules and submodules for each import. I think the question was brought up by, I think either Alex or Marston when I brought this up, was like, hey, like, should we just go all the way and make a globals feature complete out of the providers? I haven't really thought about all of the aspects of globals, and I am not like an expert about what this would potentially look like, but I think we need to follow up here and think about, if we make this feature for providers to specify configuration on an import, does it just make more sense to go all the way and effectively make a globals feature in Bicep itself and be able to specify global parameters or global configuration that can be used within any module?
Does anyone have any strong opinions, questions, clarifications, or anything like that? Obviously, this issue is public, and we'll post a link to it if we haven't already. We're happy to have this discussion asynchronously, and this is a relatively big change, so we're going to have a discussion about this for a little while at least. So there's some time here. Alex Chan has his hand up, and then Bernie.
Yeah, hi. when you're talking about globals, is this sort of like removing the need to pass parameters between modules, like needlessly? Is this what you mean by that?
So it could be that. And so I think, so initially this proposal was primarily around what it would look like to pass just this configuration that's specific to an import. And I think if you, Emily, if you click on the issue for the global configuration, I don't know how much you've given or dove into this, Alex, but I think the issue that's linked under the globals one gives an example about what this could look like potentially. Yeah, 1121. Like, this effectively would make it so you can define a parameter or define a variable that like represents the name prefix, and then inside submodules be able to specify some sort of way to get that value without having a direct reference to it. Yeah.
This would simplify at least our pipeline and templates quite a lot.
And
I would
Alex,
see this as useful.
What you're saying, not necessarily specific to the provider's configuration that Justin is walking through, but generally having global parameters that you can access from anywhere would be valuable for you?
Yes, absolutely. This would be an aside to the providers.
Is there a strong sentiment? Sorry to just
go ahead.
Close that point out. Is there a strong sentiment you can tell us with thumbs up, etc., is that globals would be a very useful feature? Okay, that's interesting.
The number of thumbs up is scary. This is so many.
Can you put a link to the issue, Justin, this issue? And if people want to thumbs up it there, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think for us, it would be really useful to get a strong read about globals in general, because if we were going to do this providers feature, there's going to be a good amount of overlap with what it would look like, as well as effectively us defining a top level thing on the deployment resource. If we were to define just something called globals there, it may be it's something we can't really like backtrack on. And so we'd really like to try getting it right the first time.
Yeah, what we don't want to end up with is having a providers section and a global section. If we're going to end up at globals, let's just get there now and have that be something that provider config can take advantage of. Bernie?
Yeah, I think it's probably a moot point now based on the thumbs up and the other comments in the chat. But yeah, I'm seeing more and more customers pretty well basically define a module deployment for the sake of getting outputs for like passing around things like lookup tables, and the tags was mentioned in the chat as well, as far as passing those type of things around through nested deployments, which is a pattern that we didn't really see at all, like with ARM templates. But it's not something that, because of the discrete nature of modules, that I guess customers are just wanting to do a lot more, and that sort of has its own challenges with then duplicate deployment names and stuff like that, causing like lock deployments and things like that, and weird timeouts when they're doing that. So yeah, I think as a general thought process, there's probably quite a few cases that would sort of unlock and sort of prevent people from doing things that then cause them pain later.
I don't. Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. I think Alex would be that person to respond to that though. Oh, his audio cut. I was like. So anyways, is there any more questions on this proposal at this point? I think that it sounds like this concept of providers is, I think we need to take a look at what it would look like to do this with globals, and especially if the customers and people in general are really looking at like globals as a big blocker, or is something that would be really useful for them, then maybe we should just go all the way with globals.
Okay, can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Cool. Any other major thoughts, concerns, questions, clarifications on this one?
Actually, one thing for me, when we're commenting on this issue, a few of you mentioned in the chat that you basically you stopped using modules or modularizing things because of a lack of globals. Would be awesome if you guys could add like examples of why, or maybe examples of what you would treat as a global in your own framework.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think I saw naming conventions and tags, but I'm sure there are other good ones, so it'd be great to see those. Cool. Ryan, do you want to go through the next one?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. I'm gonna buck the trend and camera up here. It's gonna be wild.
Nice.
And I'm gonna share my screen. So hi folks, I'm Ryan. I do a lot of work with Bicep. I'm on Justin's team. We're in the Azure CTO's office, and I have the luxury of doing a bunch of weird stuff. So that's why we're helping out with things like Bicep extensibility and some of these more wacky kinds of proposals. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and take over this. But while you're doing that, think back to that roadmap slide that Alex showed earlier about things that are coming in the run-up to 1.0, and I want to highlight two of those things. Two of the things that were on that roadmap slide were decoupling the versioning of Azure's types from the compiler, or shipping Azure version updates out of band, and preview of extensibility. And this proposal really comes from the intersection of those two things, and thinking about what we could do to simplify the experiences of working with API versions and just versioning in general in Bicep files. So I would just ask yourself, like, think about, as we're talking through this proposal, how much you love API versions, and do you love seeing them in code? Do you not love seeing them in code? Are there things that we can do to make your lives better? Because the goal of this proposal is actually, like, as we're adding new functionality, instead of layering on like more and more concepts, could we remove concepts, or could we simplify concepts, or make it so that you don't have to interact with API versions all the time? So when we talk about the versioning of Azure's types, like, what do we actually mean? Well, the compiler, when it compiles your code, does type checking against definitions that it knows from Azure. And the IntelliSense and tooling in VS Code, when you're editing, gives you IntelliSense completion, documentation, all that good stuff, based on the definitions of Azure's types. And how those definitions work is there's basically a big GitHub repo where a bunch of teams check in schemas, and there are changes happening there all the time. So that tends to move very fast. There's a lot of work going on there. There's a lot of teams contributing schemas, updating their own schemas. Sometimes it's to add something new because they added a new API, or added a new property, or added a new resource type, or a new API version. And sometimes it's to fix a mistake because either the documentation was incorrect, or something was marked as not required when it's actually required. And I'm sure we've all encountered these kinds of issues because there's a whole category of bugs for them on the Bicep repo. So the role of, I want you to understand that the role of Azure's types in the Bicep compiler is to power all of the experiences that give you tooling feedback. And there's a desire from the team to decouple the versioning of Azure's types from the versioning of the compiler. So right now, when Bicep ships an update to the compiler, that's when you get a new update to the types. You can't get a new update to the types without updating the compiler. And since the types move pretty fast, it doesn't really always make sense that those two things have to move together. The other thing about it is that updating those types does come with changes, like documentation will be different. Some properties that weren't marked as required before might be marked as required, other things corrected, other things added. There are changes that come when those types get updated. And right now you don't have a way to control what version of those types you're working with. So enter this proposal. In a world where we ship the Azure's type definition separately from the compiler, we want you, the user, to have some way to control what that version of types is. Likewise, as we're adding extensibility, everything that's defined through extensibility, say Kubernetes or AAD, comes with an import statement in the code. So you have to say, I'm using Kubernetes or I'm using AAD, and that's where you provide the configurations for those things. So I think we've used the word provider or extensibility provider to refer to that, but you can think about it of like, well, if you want to talk to Kubernetes, you have to configure which Kubernetes and how you're going to talk to it, and settings like a namespace. If you're going to talk to AAD, you probably have to configure tenant information. And that's kind of what we think about as a provider. So what if we thought about Azure as a provider? Well, that would be a good place for us to put configuration of Azure's types, as well as the configuration of anything else that could be associated with the Azure provider. Like somebody made the statement in chat of like, I would love to use globals for tags. Well, it would be really cool if we could like make that part of the configuration of the Azure provider, or some built-in mechanism that could work for you. I'm not promising to do that, by the way, just an idea that we could do that kind of thing. So the sort of nuts and bolts of this proposal is you'd have an import statement, probably import AZ, and probably something to do with a version. We're still debating if we like this idea broadly. We still want to debate what the right syntax is for it, because we had a lot of different opinions about what the right syntax is. And if you're excited about this, we'd love to hear from you about what you think is best and why. You'd have an import statement for AZ in your code that would contain a version. That would be where you would configure target scope. And anything else that we add in the future that's configuration for the Azure provider would then be part of that statement and its configuration block. That'd be part of any Bicep file or module where you interact with Azure types, and they would all get to version separately. So you could use a different version of the Azure types in a module that you wrote 6 months ago and use that from a module that you wrote today, and you're not forced to update. All of those things can live and version independently. Now, what you get out of this is, because you're now versioning the version of the Azure types as a whole, we can simplify the way that you interact with resources by making the API version optional. So one of the things that we didn't want to do before is we didn't want to leave you with like no control over what API versions you have, which is why the API version is required for every top level resource. But if we move to a model where you're versioning and controlling the version of the AZ provider, then it makes sense that you don't have to state the API version everywhere in your code that you create a resource. You would get the newest stable version for that version of the provider. So to illustrate this, here's an example before and after. So I took this from one of the official samples. I've got a storage account and I've got an Azure website. You can see I've got API versions on all of these guys. What we're talking about is we're talking about this. You would import Azure, you describe through some mechanism what version of Azure's types you're using. You can think about this as a semver package that's just going to keep marching forward in time as things are added and definitions change. And then you're not required to specify API versions on any of these things, because we would just infer the newest on any of these things. So effectively, when you update this provider, you might be updating the API version of any of your types. The interesting backstop to this is that Azure's API guidelines and the way that they want teams to do versioning of their services make it so that API version changes in practice and in theory should be safe for you. There are always cases, like all software has bugs, so there's always cases where you're going to encounter bugs, or you're going to encounter something that's incompatible, or maybe you just prefer it. So for that reason, like, it's totally fine for you to explicitly version the type of something. Let's say you want to use, you explicitly want to use a preview version of a service. Like, that's a good reason to explicitly specify the API version. Or if you just really like that, you'd still be allowed to do that. It wouldn't be that control is taken away from you. It's still an option. We just wouldn't recommend that you do it by default, and we wouldn't make it required. I think the guidance that we would give people would be, update the AZ provider when you're doing significant work on a file. Don't hard code API versions unless you need to, unless you really want to. And the thinking that the brainstorm that we sort of had with the team was, this would be simpler. It would expose you to fewer concepts. You'd have to make fewer decisions when you're writing a Bicep file, and hopefully it's simpler. Now, before anybody freaks out, because this seems like a big change to digest, the plan for, if we like this proposal and we want to go forward for it, the plan for how we would integrate this is we would roll it out over a period of several releases, and we would leverage the tools to help reduce the cost to ingest this change. So the tools would give warnings and say, hey, you need to switch from this form to this form. It would come with a code fix that could automatically import the import AZ and potentially could automatically trim API versions if that's something you want. And we would put this out there to let people give feedback for a couple months and see if we feel like we like it better, or if the change introduced any kind of like big problem that, just can't solve and it's the wrong approach. So this is not something that we would just flip a switch tomorrow and say, hey, Bicep is totally different now and your code is broken, sorry. We would use tools, and we would do this very gradually if we decided to go forward with it, to make sure that the change is very digestible. So in addition to that, I kind of want to mention, like, if you are excited about this, if you're not excited about this, if it doesn't help, even if you're neutral on this, like, would love to get your feedback in the chat or in the issue, probably would be better. We still want to solve the problem of decoupling Azure's types and the versioning of Azure's types from the compiler, even if we don't go forward with this proposal. So if something else you think makes more sense, like, let us know. If you are excited about this proposal and you do think it's cool, like, we're also debating what's the right syntax and the right way to write this import statement that would be in everybody's code. So we would also love for you to weigh in on what this would look like in code. And there's a couple options that are outlined here. Feel free to comment on these, suggest your own. It's all good. Yeah. Anything I missed, Alex?
No, I think that was a very thorough overview. Thank you. I think there's a question, Alex Chan asked a question of, like, basically, will this allow me to make API version a variable and then use string interpolation in the type string to abstract things that way? Do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, so I can answer that. So this would not do that because the compiler still wants an API version to be able to reason about the correctness of your code. So the compiler needs to understand statically the API version, like inside the compiler, inside the tools, in order to give you feedback as you're typing. Because if we don't know the API version, we effectively don't know anything about the type. What this would allow you to do is it would allow the effective API versions of your types to float along with the provider. So you'd write API versions in fewer cases, but it's not exactly what you were asking about.
I'm just looking through chat right now. During the import, would it pass down the module as well, or would we need to redo the import in each module?
You would redo the import in every module because modules version separately. So one of the key things is changing the version in your main entry point Bicep file shouldn't then break or affect the behavior of a module you wrote 6 months ago and put on your private module gallery. So each module is self-contained with respect to how it references types.
But if we had provider config and this was a provider config property, it could be set using Justin's proposal?
Yes. If it were a config, if we're asking about things like the version specifically, I think the version we decided needs to be statically known, right?
Right. I think, Ryan, do you want to talk about it today? We certainly don't have to yet, but do you want to talk about target scope as well and how that factors into some of this?
Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to do, one of the things that we were thinking about as part of this change, and this is in the proposal if you want to look at it there as well, is we would move the configuration of target scope into the configuration of the AZ provider as a property on it. Target scope still needs to be configured statically, like it still needs to be written in your code because it affects how the compiler behaves. So it can't really be a parameter unless it's something that the compiler can reason about, and it can't really be ambient. But it's always been weird that like target scope is like a statement in the language. And as a language design person, I'm just sort of like, that's not quite right. So as we're digging into extensibility, we're learning that a couple of the things that learning that a couple of things that are behaviors for Azure, if we try to generalize them for other systems, we end up with a more flexible design. So target scope would be part of the import AZ. Its default behavior wouldn't change. It would just move to a different place in the file.
Do you mind just showing the code samples for that? I just want to make sure everyone sees that clearly.
Sure.
But Ryan, speaking to the target scope, to Ryan's point, I don't think was ever thought through properly. We kind of glommed that on towards the end. And this is a much better layering to put it here inside of the import statement of AZ. So I just want people to take a second to look at that. And I think the thing that goes with this, because we kind of got this one piece of one particular statement type wrong, we may want to, or it's worth considering doing a breaking change to say this is the only way that you can set target scope, and doing that over several releases as well, of course. But curious if people are kind of grokking what I'm describing. Would they be okay with a breaking change to kind of get to a better kind of language design place? Any thumbs up or deep concerns or anything like that? And you can express this in the issue as well, of course. Okay, less thumbs up than what people wanted for globals, but still some thumbs up.
Do people, I mean, let me ask the question, I guess, show of hands, like, do you like API versions in the state that they're in now and don't want to change, even if it reduces the amount of places you have to specify them?
Is there anyone who has a deep concern with implementing this, saying that it would make the files too complicated, it would introduce one concept too far, or anything like that? Stan, can you speak more towards, sorry for cutting you off, Nikolai, this desire for RPs to participate? We would basically just automatically take the latest version. It would be as if you just, when you see an API version, you just hit enter one more time, is effectively what we're preventing you from having to type.
Yeah, I think most of the problems will come that when you have some kind of breaking change, you need to document that, and basically you need to document every change on every RP that you're bumping with every release. And I don't think that will happen because of the participation of the different teams building the RPs. On top of that, you also have some weird issues between RPs. For example, with one RP version, you're deploying Global Alert v1. With another RP version, you're deploying Global Alert v2. So with single version of the AZ import, you will not be able to do both if you want to. So these kind of things that, as I said, I don't want to give the what if example again, but it's very good example of different teams not participating and this ruling in the future that I think is very good.
And so your main point, I think, that I took away is that the scope of doing an update, even though you're pinned to a version, going from version AZ version 0.7 to 0.8 could be very impactful, and unless everything's very well documented, you'll miss it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Because when we increase a version of a specific RP or specific given resource, we basically go and see the documentation for that, and we figure out if there are any changes that are significant. So some RPs we're going to see APIs are updated. There is no even single change from new property or remove property, but there are other RPs that have quite significant change between different API versions. So it really depends per resource provider. And that's one thing that you mentioned, that is maybe instead of importing an AZ module, you should import, for example, AZ.compute or AZ.aks, etc., in order to make these more flexible to use per resource provider.
Makes sense. Kailas,
Yeah,
do you want to go next?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. API versions, when we defined while creating modules or provisioning it, it's like I'm programming it against some stable version and I rely on it. It would be repeatable again and again. Once I define module, it can be consumed by hundreds of people, hundreds of teams within your organization, your enterprise. If you lose control over it, small thing can break for some of the teams, and that could be critical depending on nature of organization or industry you work with. So having version is good thing. Having option to not define on local development or your lower environment development is good, but the moment you go for serious workload and talk about higher environments, it should be there as per my view.
I think an important point that I want to make sure everyone's on the same page on is that we still have a firm stance on never auto upgrading anything. We want pinned API versions everywhere. What this proposal changes is instead of pinning at the resource level, you pin at a larger level, at the provider level. So we would still, even if you're maintaining modules that are being used by many people, your version would be pinned. Absolutely. Does that make sense, Kawas?
Yes, I would. If this option is there, it's nice. But if we want to control version on granular level, that flexibility should be there.
Makes sense.
Because it's a very contextual decision one has to take. So if both options are there, it's good.
Cool. Mikolai?
Yeah, so basically what I think in my case is that I think it will be very hard to see which versions are there and refer to the documentation on the page, on the examples, and see if there's something new. Because if I have like some type and there will be a bunch of list of type and version, which is, I don't know, do we will bump this type version every single time some new API comes in, new version of something, so there'll be a lot of updates, a lot of places to update, a lot of places to check. It might be very hard to maintain, and I think the proposal with that being able to define for like a project scope a single version for a particular type, I don't know, for a web app, for something like that, it will be much more helpful.
Okay, makes sense. And I think, for whatever it's worth, breaking changes as it relates to getting them documented and categorized and organized is one of the few things I think we do decently well across all of Azure. I shudder to use the word decently because that's a pretty high bar, but there's a lot of people who care a lot about breaking changes, and it does get captured by the Swagger generation pipeline. So at least in theory, we should be able to document it, tool it, all of it, to say you just moved from it to a breaking version. Are you sure you want to do this? That could be a linter rule. So I think the concerns are all valid, and it's really great that we're having this discussion, but there at least are ways to deal with some of these things, I think.
Alex, could you include maybe like if you move to this model, maybe add the versions that got consumed to maybe the metadata of the Bicep so that's actually trackable and reportable?
Yeah, I think I saw Stan put it in the chat. Like if you hovered over the resource, we would show you which version we're using. So we would try to float that detail up if you wanted it, wherever it was relevant.
Well, I mean, even in the build, and if you're compiling, you actually store it. You've got, that existing Bicep metadata that you could also include that as sort of stamped with the template.
Yeah, yes, we could is the short answer. We could put which types of version we used in the template metadata. The resources that are declared in the template would have the actual API version that we would use. So yes is the short answer, and we could explore the nuances of what should be where. Cool. Any last major thoughts on this one? This was a great discussion.
I think I saw Johnny's hand up for a little bit. I wasn't sure. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I wanted to underline something that Stan ended up saying, which is that there's quite a bit that goes into the AZ modules. So exploring something like import az.compute or az.storage for allowing more targeted configuration might be something that could remove some complexity from the way we need to configure that particular provider.
Cool. Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of these are good old-fashioned programming language problems, right? And Ryan and Justin have a lot of experience there. A lot of you all on this call have a lot of experience with different languages. So this is not a new problem. Different languages have solved this in different ways, some more successfully than others. So we just want to make sure that we're really deeply considering all these sorts of things as we make some of these decisions. Any other last major thoughts? Okay. Carla?
Oh, maybe, yeah. last minute. Yeah, the question is, so sort of the aspect I'm trying to get my head around is with reviews, usually it's really nice to have explicit information, like when you have a handover of one of these files. So it's nice that you have sort of, you can't get into the thought process of the one that wrote it precisely. So, but if you're reviewing it, then it would be really nice to have the explicit versions of at least a telltale sign that this type of API, this version of the API was used. I think that would be beneficial.
And Carlo, I'm not trying to like pick on you or anything, obviously, but when you see a particular API version, do you like know inherently that's a good one or that's a bad one?
Within the customer I'm working in, they have what you say, a no-go for preview APIs. So they like everything to be solid engineering that they're relying on. So from that perspective, it would just stand out easily if someone has already used the preview API.
Makes sense. I think there are things that we can do there as well. Like we could have, you know, Stan brought up what we sometimes call these perpetual previews, where it's a preview forever. I happen to work on one of them, and those would be included in the types package. Because we consider them GA APIs because they've been preview basically for too long and it's the latest version. But even within that, right, we could conceivably have a version of the types that is no previews. I don't even care if you consider a GA version, right? So we can do some of those things and lint for them and do all that stuff as well.
Yeah, that would help definitely. Yep, thanks.
Cool. Great.
I'm going to go back to the presentation because we have a couple more slides and it looks like people are asking for the next topic.
So we have 6 minutes. I wanted to just to kind of walk through the code of extensibility because I thought we had done it on a community call, but we haven't. I will literally bring it up for 5 minutes. And while I do that, I can speak to some of the other questions. So let me start sharing. Can folks see the screen? Okay. So we just wanted to show where we're at with extensibility. We've talked about it a lot. We have teams testing this provider that I'm showing internally to kind of run it through its paces and see what pops out. So everything's kind of working, and there's a build of Bicep where you can opt into some of these extensibility capabilities, but you will not be opted in service side. So you could author it, but you can't deploy it today would be the issue. If you're interested in that, we're happy to let you know what you need to do to onboard to that. In this particular example, I have a main.bicep, and it's deploying 2 modules. One is AKS, nothing special about this, and another is Kubernetes. And I'll talk about this in a second, but the important bit is I'm deploying AKS, and I'm getting as an output kubeconfig. So Justin was walking us through what it might be like to pass provider information. This is related to that, but here's literally how the Kubernetes cluster that we're about to talk to, here's the kubeconfig that allows us to talk to it. If I go and look at this Kubernetes.bicep file, I see this import statement. So we saw this a few times today as well. I'm importing Kubernetes. I'm giving it this alias of K8s. I don't need an alias, so I could get rid of it. And I think maybe it's required right now, but I don't know if it will be when we ship it. But here's some of my configuration. Here's where kubeconfig lives. I have regular Bicep variables. I could have regular Bicep parameters, so I could have additional ones to this. And then I have regular Kubernetes resource types. So this is, there was an internal MVP thread about this. I think it's fine to talk about it. This is what Kubernetes naturally looks like in Bicep. So if we do nothing, which is what we've done here, this is the shape of those resources. So you should see property names that you're familiar with, like metadata and spec and so on and so forth. And if I'm missing something that I need, and I don't know, I'm not a Kubernetes expert, folks.
Take out spec.
Thank you.
Replica is not required.
I'm getting errors because we understand the structure, the schema of this type, just like we do with ARM types. So the thread was about, oh, this is verbose. Look at all these brackets, blah, blah, blah. I understand that. I don't necessarily disagree with it. But the benefit of authoring this in Bicep, whether you want to or not, is totally fine, is you get a lot of this type-aware information. So if I want to add something to spec, those are all the properties that I can add. And we can be just as dynamic in day zero with Kubernetes types as we can with ARM types because they're auto-generated. And I can do string interpolation. So if I wanted to change this and do, not that I would want to necessarily do this, but I could do front name here. And that would just work. So where you might be using Customize or even Helm to do some kind of like basic expressions and kind of dynamic code, some of that kind of falls out naturally with Bicep and it plugs into your ARM ecosystem because you're going to be creating AKS clusters and that kind of thing. You can imagine this working with AAD similarly, but just wanted to kind of show what this is. And this just deploys, right? So I do AZ deployment create, pointed at this module or this main.bicep, and everything works as expected. ARM knows how to handle this completely, and it just kind of works. So that is what Kubernetes extensibility actually looks like and behaves like. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but I'll try to answer Stan since his hand is up.
I was thinking maybe the idea would be if you have some kind of function within ARM that basically takes existing configuration of strings and then converts it to the JSON format. Would that be maybe possible to provide the scenarios where people have these existing configurations and they just want to apply them via Bicep?
You're talking about like YAML manifests that have already been written?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could definitely have load YAML content, my manifest.yaml.
But it will be good if it can be passed via string from parameter. So it's not a load YAML, but rather than something that converts it.
I don't think I totally followed that.
So something like convert from YAML to JSON. So you can pass the configuration as a string from the parameters rather than being in a specific file. Because when it's in a file, it makes it static. So it needs to be in the template itself as a static value rather than having something general that basically can you can pass any configuration that you want. And for one environment it can be this configuration, for another environment it can be that.
Got it. Yeah, I think we would, something like this. This could be YAML loaded from a file or just whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
I think
that to cover existing scenarios.
I think the key thing is the parameters, the way he was describing.
That it's here, not inside of the file. that what you're saying?
It sounds like the YAML would be parameterized, and you would be able to configure, you pass in the parameters into it. So you basically, the idea is you share the YAML instead of just having a copy in the Bicep file.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think that's on point as well. There were a couple questions about AAD specifically that I'll try to answer as well. So one is the AAD version of this provider. AAD is a slow-moving ship, folks. You thought ARM was slow-moving. AAD is crawls, as it should, because you don't want to mess with identity too quickly. There's a POC that has started, so they're working on it. We think the POC will go well. We think people will like it. We'd like to show it off in a future community call. Don't have a clear ETA, at least 3 to 6 months, likely more than that, but not sure yet. The plans will start to solidify over time. The plan is to support service principles, group assignment, and there's one other that I'm forgetting. Service principle CRUD, group assignment CRUD.
Apps?
And there's one, what's that?
Applications?
I think service principles covers applications, but I don't know. I don't know
Service
for sure.
principle is enterprise app and app registration, I guess.
Yeah, I think all of those are. I won't claim to understand the inner workings of Graph, but I think that is bundled under service principles. It may not be, and we'll get you more details on that. But we're trying to cover those basics, even though there's a huge ecosystem of Graph resource types. Though there's clearly a set of a few that need to be supported right away. And there's a combination of the provider needs to be written, and some of the Graph APIs themselves need to be changed to be properly idempotent. Our old dear friend Christopher Bash, who many of you know, works on the identity team now, so he's probably the only one who understands enough of ARM and enough of identity to really broker this properly. So we work closely with him to make sure that all of this is happening appropriately prioritized in the right order and so on. Any major questions that I've missed in the chat? Okay. We're going to stop here. We can talk more about extensibility providers, obviously, and we will as we make more and more progress on this. But we're 4 minutes over, so we should wrap it up. Stephanie, I don't know if there's anything that you had in particular to close out the conversation.
No, I think that's the last topic for today. We had some requested updates from the GitHub issue, but we can tack that on to the next call.
Cool. As always, it's like ridiculous that we can just every month, 100 of us approximately can come together and we can walk through really early, rough proposals and have all sorts of conversation about it in a really comfortable way, because this saves us a tremendous amount of time. If we get these things wrong, now is the right time to know about them, right? So you coming to these consistently makes a huge difference. I mean, this is how I hope all the teams that I work on operate in the future, because it's just easier. So thank you for making that possible. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks to you.